I'm excited to be here with you all and everybody in the metaverse or over video. Excited to share with you the work that I've been doing, both on my patient journey and with WeSauna, which I'm a co-founder and CEO of. So we'll start with my journey. As a patient, being forced into retirement at an early age. I retired from the NHL in 2015 after my 7th diagnosed concussion. I was dealing with symptoms like light sensitivity, slurred speech, headache, head pressure, insomnia, impulse control issues, appetite loss, short-term, long-term memory loss, on top of anxiety, depression, and then ultimately suicidal ideation. So needless to say, it's very difficult to do your job as a professional athlete when you're dealing with these types of symptoms. So I saw in a former teammate who'd recently passed away very similar symptoms. He passed away from stage 3 CTE. And earlier in that year, I'd had my first child, and I thought it pretty prudent to start thinking about stepping away from the game. Part of my role in the game, I fought 164 times, so there was a lot of damage done to my brain. So that really started for the last 8 years, this patient journey. And the first things that I looked at were diagnostics. So trying to get a handle on what areas of my brain, body, ocular system, vestibular system, autonomic system were shut down due to trauma, and then how I can fix them. So a lot of concussion clinics, neurodegenerative disease clinics, learning about CT, brain pathology, reading as much as I could through PubMed papers on what had happened to me and how I could fix it. Spent a lot of my own personal money because a lot of these services are expensive and not covered by insurance quite yet. Hopefully we can get there one day. And I kept hearing a lot of similar things in these clinics, which is the key is neuroplasticity. Or neuroregeneration through things like neurofeedback, supplementation regimens. And as I was going through this journey, I was taking QEEGs every 6 months, and I was also testing my blood. I was cycling through different therapeutics and different things like neurofeedback, but I was also coupling that with float tanks, hyperbaric chamber treatments, other holistic tools that could essentially flush out inflammation and promote this neuroplasticity event in my brain. I got to a point 5 years in, so this is 3 years ago, where I think a lot of TBI survivors get to. There's a multitude of symptoms, and I became hopeless and suicidal when I thought I didn't have anything else to try. So that was a really scary place because 3 years ago, then I had 3 children and I didn't want anything to do with them and just acting very strangely and could tell that I had mild dementia and that I needed to really radically try something else if I wanted to save my life. Luckily, a former teammate reached out to me and told me about magic mushrooms, or the active ingredient being psilocybin. And I thought, well, this is strange, but maybe it could help. So I looked into some of the research and realized what it was doing in the brain when somebody was under psilocybin, under fMRI. And I thought, I really didn't have much of another option. So I took an invitation to this decriminalized farm, and I partook in a ceremony. So it was a large dose of psilocybin, over 5 grams. And it was a difficult journey because specifically what magic mushrooms do, and I'll just talk about psilocybin here because I feel like there needs to be a little bit more education when we say psychedelics. Not all psychedelics are the same. MDMA is much different from psilocybin. Psilocybin's much different from LSD. That's much different from ketamine and from ibogaine and from 5-MeO-DMT and ayahuasca, which I've had the pleasure of working with all of them. But I partook in this ceremony, and I woke up the next day. I describe it as feeling the way I should. So I had a little bit more energy. and I wanted to, just call my wife and FaceTime with my kids and get home. But I stayed on that farm for 2 weeks, learning about other agents that could help, like lion's mane that increases BDNF, and CBD, that's a natural anti-inflammatory. And on that farm, 3 days in, my slurred speech was no longer present. My light sensitivity dropped off at day 4. I had less head pressure, way less brain fog, brain fatigue, and I was pretty amazed. And I also knew that nothing gets fixed in 5 hours. So I made a regimen with this PhD biochemist of naturally derived CBD kief and psilocybin, so a microdose regimen that I could start when I got home. And I went home and had a little bit of a washout period, and then began to use this medicine in a very specific way that worked for me. There's a bunch of different protocols. And I used that for 6 months. So I took, on the left, before I went to the farm, this QEEG, obviously with a lot of abnormalities. And then I retested my brain and my blood 6 months in, after 2 high doses of psilocybin and this very specific microdosing regimen. And it came back, both my blood and the QEEG, with no abnormalities, 6 months in. So I thought, wow, obviously this is pretty amazing. So I started to, talk about my personal journey so that it could hopefully help others through the Decriminalized Nature Network. And I thought, well, concussion survivors is no FDA-approved pharmaceutical, and possibly this could be the first one. So after about 6 months, after I received the QEG, so a year into my journey, I really started to think very hard about how I could make a company out of this and how I can try to develop this medicine through the proper regulatory pathways with the proper scientific rigor. So I founded WeSauna about 2 years ago, and its mission is to help people transcend barriers in mental health and performance. We're talking about depression and anxiety and the things that affect people, as we should. But I think that we can get to a place where I am now, which is completely cured and the highest operating form of myself. And I continue to keep getting better, which is pretty amazing. So we can, touch on that once we figure out this mental health pandemic. And so, as most of you know, there's a waning effect to psilocybin. So there's no magic bullet for anything. And that's been proven out both in my personal story and through the largest phase 2b study done by Compass with their COMP360. It's also been proven out with the Card-Harris study done in 2015, which was one of the first studies that I saw that I thought, wow, this could definitely be a medicine. And a lot of companies are focusing on high dose. One of the things that I think that we need to look at is how we increase the efficacy after a high dose of psilocybin. So whether that's psychotherapy or in our case, the microdose in combination with CBD, or even SSRIs or antidepressants done at a lower dose. And so WeSauna's strategy is to use these complementary molecules, psilocybin and CBD, CBD being the only patented neuroprotectant on earth, patented by the US government in 2003 against neuronal death, specific towards Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and dementia. And then psilocybin with its neuroplastic event, shutting down the default mode network at high doses, increasing neuronal crosstalk, and something that we don't get to talk about a lot, it's anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects. So we use these studied molecules that have been studied alone, increasing, psilocybin has shown to increase brain connectivity and resting blood flow. Psilocybin has been shown to have rapid effects on treatment-resistant depression. CBD is a neuroprotectant, as I'd mentioned, in brain ischemia mice models. And then CBD and psilocybin independently have both been shown to significantly affect migraine days. The reason I talk about migraine days, and this is a classic telltale story. My wife saw the recovery in myself, and she wanted to try it, but she didn't want to hallucinate. So luckily, we had a subperceptual non-hallucinogenic microdose that she could try, that she's now been on for 1.5 years, and she has not had a migraine day. And her migraine days would put her down for 2 or 3 days and hugging the toilet. And if you've ever known somebody with migraine, you know that story. It's very painful. So these are some of the examples of and components independently of Sauna 13. So when I created my team, and I'll give them a shout out, they didn't put themselves on a slide here, but Mark Wingert-san, our Chief Scientific Officer, and Jeffrey Jewell and Stacy Abbey. How do we reproduce my experience in animals? So to start with, we need to prove that psilocybin will work in the existing animal models of behavioral despair. This is the study that we first ran, looking at a loading dose of psilocybin, imipramine, and the combination of the two to validate that the animal model would work. So you see here, we used the tail suspension test performed on days 15, 22, and 29 in each group to determine the effect and duration of the effect. So the data that you're looking at right now are from day 15, and you can see that imipramine given 1 hour prior to the test lowered immobility time, similarly to the loading dose of psilocybin giving 14 days earlier. The study with both imipramine and a loading dose of psilocybin giving 14 days earlier showed even greater reductions in immobility times, which would indicate a complementary effect. So this is the data from the same arms at the study at day 22. So as you can see, imipramine, again, dosed 1 hour prior to the test, shows effectiveness, as does the psilocybin that was given 21 days earlier. The difference between the two arms has become more pronounced at 3 weeks post-dosing. More surprisingly were the results from the combination arm, which at this point was showing what appeared to be synergistic effects. And Matus is going to come up after me and present a little bit more on this and the 29-day effects. So just dating that back to like how I personally feel now, it seems that my brain is stronger. It's better protected against things like alcohol, and I need less of the psilocybin and the CBD now that I've been on this for 3 years. So it's a nice effect that I thought could happen. So as that relates to WeSauna, we included obviously this data in our IP, and we also included this data along with a multitude of safety data. That was a booklet well over 300 pages, and submitted that to the FDA around December. And we sat down with them and had our pre-IND meeting on March 11th. And so we went in with TBI-related MDD, major depressive disorder. We did that for a number of different reasons. And they said a few very interesting things. Obviously, CBD, they're well aware of with Epidiolex. And psilocybin, as I mentioned, there's a ton of safety data, low abuse liability, et cetera. So using that first generation compound and then getting our other IP through the method of use and then formulation work, they were very well familiar with both. So they did 4 things that were very surprising. So they expanded us and our indication into MDD alone. So this was a strategy we took because we're treating symptoms of traumatic brain injury. Although I mentioned I'm cured, hopefully we'll get there one day with better endpoints for TBI survivors. But right now, you have to treat the symptoms. And so that was surprising. They also accelerated us to a 1B2A. They said that this metabolizes differently in healthy norms, which it doesn't, but we'll take it. So we'll be moving into a 1B/2A, and they accepted our full farm tox program. So that means that the FDA is amendable to an at-home use, self-administered, low, non-hallucinogenic dose of a combination therapy of psilocybin and CBD. And we're also leveraging the 505(b)(2) pathway for CBD. So the meeting was overwhelmingly successful. We have a pre-IND number on migraine as well. They gave us a call, and they offered up suggested some other orphan indications, which we've turned around and filed IP on May 3rd. So needless to say, it was a successful meeting. Now, since the FDA suggested that we could study SANA-13 in MDD patients, we redesigned our phase 1 study to incorporate both healthy normal subjects and MDD subjects, which is shown here. The reason we're doing this is because the filed IP that we have on the method of use with the TBI symptoms encompasses over 40 indications. So we want optionality to be able to address any number of those indications with either a high dose of psilocybin, just the low dose, self-administered at home of psilocybin, or the combination of both. Because in my experience, you do not need 5 grams. When we say a high or a loading dose, it seems to be that as I continue to use this medicine, I can increase the efficacy of my microdose by just doing a little bit of a higher dose that is still subperceptual on the weekends. So I've been playing around with that for the last year and a half. So Arm 1 will look at the pharmacokinetics of low-dose CBD and then high-dose CBD. Arm 2 will examine the effects of low dose of psilocybin, followed by a loading dose of psilocybin, and then by a combination of the low-dose psilocybin and the maximum tolerated dose of CBD from Arm 1. The phase 1A, 2B study is planned for Q4 of this year. So this feedback from the FDA has obviously changed our development path. And as shown from a time perspective in this diagram, the currently designed 1B/2A will now support IND filings for migraine, as well as the other 3 orphan indications. So we've taken the time to secure SANA-13 with intellectual property filings, mostly focused on method of use, provisional IP, and we're working on our formulation IP right now across a number of different disease states as well. I'm sure, as everybody knows in this room, IP is very important to both raising money and moving through this pathway. And we're in talks right now with 2 companies to co-develop this with us, which their main crux of their business is taking off-patent generics, reformulating, securing IP, and securing revenue from that standpoint. So to summarize, we are meeting with the MHRA this month. So multiple regulatory interactions. One thing that we see a lot in the industry right now is a lot of people talking. Not a lot of people have this regulatory interactions, and if they just did, then they would exactly know what to do from a development standpoint. So the non-clinical farm tox is ongoing, full non-clinical farm tox. So that's exciting, and like I mentioned before, it'll support MDD and other orphan indications. We're quickly advancing to clinical studies, looking to initiate that in human in Q4, outside of the IND as we continue to finish our farm tox and open up the IND, hopefully in Q1 with the FDA. And then strong IP, just compositions and methods for 5 disease states, and formulation development of the novel delivery release system, complementary novel combination that makes up SANA-13. So yeah, that is WeSana. If there's any questions, I'll take them now.
So if no questions from the live audience yet, there's a question that came in virtually. It sounds like you went through quite an ordeal trying to find out the ideal dose.
Yeah.
And was the major reason for that was to reduce the hallucinogenic properties? Were there any other side effects that were not ideal in trying to fine tune the dose?
So no, I think the tricky part was figuring out when to take the microdose after a high dose, because there is a period that the microdose, even being how small it is, like I take the lowest efficacious dose, even 2 weeks after the large dose, it was still initiating hallucinogenic or perceptual effects. So just finding that window, no, but no other adverse effects. I mean, sleep was improved. You know, obviously there's a spiritual aspect to this that, you know, in high dose ceremonies, you have to just really be prepared. So, you know, when you're doing high dose psychedelics, there's a thing called setting, and dosage. So set being the intention of why you're doing it, especially with psilocybin, because it exasperates, it's at the forefront of your mind. So say, for example, somebody has sexual trauma, you have to prepare this person because they will relive the trauma most likely that's governing their life. So you really have to prepare them for what they're about to see. And when you dose them correctly, you have to put them in the right setting. So, you know, you hear about bad trips. Obviously, people have adverse experiences because they don't manage setting and dosage. They take too high of a dose and they go to a concert. So setting is really important. So from the clinical standpoint, and the way I've experienced it, just done, you know, get the 3 kids out of the house and make sure you're guarding your energy, and make sure you have somebody sitting there with you to help guide you through. And that can be a professional, mental health professional, therapist, a psychonaut that's done the medicine before. And they're able to help, you know, guide you through so that you have a good experience. On the subperceptual side, with CBD and natural mushrooms, I've felt nothing but just good. It's just a really happy place. It feels like just a natural Prozac, I guess, without the side effects. So yeah, no adverse side effects. Maybe some gut stuff, but you know, this fits into the 5-HT2A receptor, and 80 to 90% of those are in our stomach. So if you have, you know, the classic gut rut from psilocybin, that's because that's where it attaches. So, and then, yeah, just taking it on an empty stomach does different things. It definitely makes it much stronger. So the pH is something that we're playing with in the belly. So, yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Great talk. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So you've had great success with the follow-up microdosing, which is fantastic. Do you think you needed the initial high dose? Would you?
Nope.
No. Okay. Interesting.
Yep. Yeah, I've seen and read about hundreds of thousands of people that just do the microdose, and so you just switch the regimen. So you just front load the microdosing so that it gets into the system. The ideal way, right, for sure would be like a loading dose to reset the system and then followed on by a microdose. But I've seen, like my wife, you know, there's a lot of people in this world that are not going to want to hallucinate as a first line of defense. For treatment-resistant depression, when people are suicidal, and to knock out the bad thoughts, and I think it's very important to have that spiritual experience, to use a high dose. But for mild depression, somebody goes to the doctor, they're just starting out on this depression journey, and you recommend that to somebody in a clinic, right, for 8 hours. Is that the first line of defense? Or can we use these microdoses as an antidepressant? So,
And are you able to share what those orphan indications were?
No,
Okay.
not right now. Soon. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan,
Yeah, of course.
for sharing that fascinating story.
Yeah.
So I have two questions. One
Uh-huh.
is, you started off with depression symptoms in TBI,
Mm-hmm.
but then you spoke to the FDA and you got just MDD as an indication to pursue. So how did that transition happen? How did the FDA decide on just go after MDD versus because they do accept symptomatic treatments in various.
Yeah, they specifically mentioned that obviously we know it's a heterogeneous disease, so it'd be a little bit harder to develop. But so with TBI, you go to the doctor, right? Like in my experience and with vets and other athletes, and they treat the symptoms. They don't ask you about your car accident. They don't ask you, about your professional career. So the pathway that the FDA was very specific and suggestive in their response. And if we want to treat TBI-related depression, they essentially asked us, what's the difference between emotional depression and physical depression? Nobody on earth can answer that for them right now. So they told us to go after the broader population. And in phase 3, we can not enrich the trials, but we can include TBI survivors with MDD and get a carve out in the label.
Okay. One more quick question. Did you do much of the dose response work? Or was that based on your personal experience?
Did I
Talked about
do?
protocols, right? The Stamets protocol, the Fadiman protocol, etc.
Yeah.
But for your studies,
Mhm.
did you actually show a dose response in your non-clinical work or farm work?
Matus, are you coming up with that? With the CBD?
There was no dose response. There was just defined dose for the loading dose and then microdosing. We have tested some of it and we will be testing more on the more chronic scale later, but there was no dose response.
Okay. And one last brief one.
Yeah.
You're pursuing the standard classic pharmaceutical development. It's not you're not using mushrooms and
Synthetic.
it's not botanicals.
Synthetic. Yep,
Thank you.
of course.
Thanks for your talk. That was really great.
Of course, man.
Couple quick ones. You made like a side comment, better protects against alcohol.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate briefly?
Yeah, so I don't know how to, I'm just better protected against, it's harder to get intoxicated. So it seems to protect the brain. I theorize what it's doing. And so, yeah, I'm just, receptors are strengthened and,
So you're saying on like an acute current basis, not from, oh, I drank too much alcohol before and had an issue. And now you're saying that like if you were to have a drink tonight, you would be less inebriated than otherwise.
affects me less, yeah.
Got it. And then related question, you mentioned for the loading dose or the macro dose, 5 grams of dried mushrooms.
Mhm.
Obviously different mushrooms have different percentages of psilocybin and coactives,
Of course,
but
take the rule of like 10% on average.
okay, that's
Right.
what I was going to ask.
Yep.
You're doing, so for your standard microdose, you're talking about 0.5 gram of dried mushrooms.
No,
What
way less.
okay, so I guess that was my second question. What range are you working in for the regular microdose so far as grams of dried mushrooms?
Yeah, I think we'll keep that. Mark wants me to keep that in-house right now.
Cool.
But just take you can go and read, right, about it. It's usually between 0.08 and up to 0.5 gram. Sometimes a 0.5 gram doesn't affect somebody, right? And yeah, this is definitely not milligram per kilogram. This is very dependent on metabolism. So,
Understood.
yeah.
Yeah. I had a question about the mg per kg thing, but I think I'll save that for the next time.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. A few more questions from the virtual audience.
Okay.
So what is your long-term vision for Waysana?
My long-term vision is to show efficacy in the broadest population that I can and try to move this as far along as possible. with my skill set, so obviously I'm very well aware that, I'm a former hockey player, and so I've surrounded myself with a drug development team who has over 175 years of experience and has developed numerous medicines, and we use a CRO that is top notch. So yeah, I want to continue to provide hope for people and develop this as quickly and as effectively as possible. So
Great. I think a good follow-up to that would be this other question. Sounds like you're working with the NHL, but have you worked with the NFL or International Cycling Union about partnering with you?
Yeah, so we've had some really interesting talks. Cycling's actually, there's a ton of TBI in that community. I've talked with the NHLPA, the NHLAA, the NFL, Jerry Jones. I've sat down in the UFC and given a presentation to Dana White and the whole brass. We had a LOI with the World Boxing Council. One of the things that can help with destigmatizing these medicines is using the athletic and celebrity platform to shift pop culture. But there's just so many misconceptions about, what these medicines can do. And there's numerous different ways, as I mentioned, to use psilocybin. You can use it as a high dose, a low dose. You can use it within a group setting. You can do it on your own. You can do it as a nature walk. You can do it inside. You can eat and then do it, and you'll have a less of an effect. You can go into it with an empty stomach. There's so many ways to just educate people on it. As far as sports go, it's a Schedule I. So other than the UFC that uses WADA, everybody else, it's on their banned substance list. But I know a couple hundred athletes that are definitely using it, for just to protect the brain and flush out inflammation.
And are there any other question over here?
Thank you. Thanks, Dan, for a great talk. I just have a question. And obviously, we're in a really interesting space in the psychedelic space where we're sort of getting the human data before a lot of basic research. So I had a question about the model of back translation that you're using, so the tail suspension test. And obviously, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the sort of treatment paradigm. So obviously now a lot of the trials are addressing major depressive disorder or treatment-resistant depression, where there's a huge variation in the patients, but they already are there with the depression. And it looks like in your preclinical model where you're doing the tail suspension that you're changing, by preloading with psilocybin, you're actually changing the ability to cope in a situation where there is a situational stressor. And I just wondered what your thoughts are on the capabilities of psilocybin, not only as a sort of treatment, but also in that sort of earlier space around protective effects in a stressful situation and, the capacity to cope in those types of environment.
So your question is specific to how psilocybin is changing somebody's ability to cope with depression in a high dose?
Yeah, or even in a stressful situation, like in the forced tail suspension, having, the animal, you're preloading with psilocybin, then you're putting the animal in a stressful situation. So it's not already got depression, but it's coping in a different environment. So I just was thinking about, what you were talking about the sort of longer term vision for psilocybin, not only as a treatment, but as a sort of wellness.
Yeah. So, maybe Matus, it's a better question for him. I don't dip my toe too far into the scientific realm. So, I don't know if we know the answer. I just think it's an interesting question based on the types of. So you're asking basically if somebody has psilocybin in their system, you're saying that they'd be better able to cope with trauma? Yeah, or a situation, say. Yeah, it definitely. Don't disappear, right? If you have a loss of a family member or a stressful situation at work. Yeah, you just have a less of an emotional response. It actually does go away. Yeah. So when you use it in a high dose, and you're able to look at the trauma, you're able to work through the trauma. I mean, I'm a sexual abuse survivor. I've had a ton of physical trauma. I've had a lot of emotional trauma in my childhood, and as a minor. And so I've done a lot of work on myself spiritually with this, and I have less of a response when I talk about it now. So I definitely think that, you know, just it's all dependent on the individual. I can't speak for anybody else, but for me, in my own experience, I'm much calmer around my children, and I'm more in the present moment. And as a CEO and an entrepreneur, the more data you can take in the present moment, the better decisions you can make. So it helps me stay in that moment. Yeah, there's a bunch of different effects, yeah, that seem to be happening. And there's a lot of retreats outside of the US that, you know, are combining psychedelic medicine now, you know, specifically for sexual abuse survivors, where psilocybin can be harsh at the beginning. So they're preloading with MDMA and then giving psilocybin. So there's some really interesting work going on. And obviously MDMA just dampening the amygdala response and the fear response. So it's working really well in veterans. And yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a bit of a discussion.
Yeah, of course.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Are you measuring inflammatory markers in the blood?
In these animal studies, or will we be in the?
Both?
Yeah, we will be. Yep, absolutely. And we'll be doing some cognitive testing. Yep. And then hopefully, you know, discovering a secondary endpoint would be nice to have. So something like QEEG.
Sure. With your different paradigms of dosing, it seems like if you could measure some type of predictor of response to understand who might respond or not, if it really is a effective inflammation that these compounds are reducing, would be interesting to see.
Yeah. I think it's on the science team's radar for sure.
Hey, Daniel,
Hey, Sue.
do you think on the orphan drug status, what are the advantages of that? Because I heard, and I see so many people pursuing it, and I wasn't sure what specific, does the government actually provide some kind of subsidy for those clinical trials, or is there tax credits or something that?
No. You can move right into a phase 3 with an accepted briefing booklet, and a smaller study sample size.
Okay.
It's been used effectively with like Epidiolex. They didn't start in childhood epilepsy. They started with 2 orphan indications and then bolted on others.
Oh, I see.
So it's a pretty classic, you know, small cap drug development strategy.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize, so they would actually suggest that to you is really a big victory. I see what you're saying, because you didn't even go in there with that notion.
No, but we have a pre-IND number on migraine.
Yeah, that's
So.
great. Oh, congrats, man.
Thanks, Sue.
Yeah, I think we have time for another virtual question. In your experience, how would you rate the synthetic versus natural version of
Yeah,
psilocybin?
so I can't speak to that. I only stay in my lane. I haven't tried synthetic psilocybin. But, you know, there's been a lot of indigenous people that have and said that the spirit is still there. So, you know, I kind of go with the notion of there's a lot of talk in this industry about naturally extracting and how much better is natural versus synthetic. I don't know, but synthetic psilocybin in the most active ingredient, we don't know what norbaeocystin's doing. But it's you know, this is a game of speed and getting patients something that synthetically derived psilocybin's been around for a very, very long time. They're very familiar with it. And synthetic CBD in combination with synthetic psilocybin, I believe very strongly will help millions of people.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think if there are no other questions,
Cool.
thank you, Daniel.
All right, thanks,
That was
everyone.